Any comment about that?
Well, I mean, I would refer you back to my first answer to you, is that any intensification of the conflict, especially when civilians pay the price, is of concern to us. Okay, Deji, Stefano, and then we'll close it out.
Just very quickly about UNRWA, let me just ask you this question. Is UNRWA ready to close its operation in Israel once Israel decided to implement in the two bills passed by Knesset?
What does that mean? Is it ready?
Will UNRWA follow the order?
I don't, let me put it, we fully understand, well, let me put it, the laws were passed.
Yeah.
We're still trying, months after they were passed, trying to get clarification and clear clarification from the Israeli authorities as what exactly the implementation is, because we're not getting the same answers from different interlocutors. Obviously, we will not, if we're blocked from operating, we will be blocked from operating. Stefano.
Yes, as a follow-up, I don't know, WFP, UNICEF, and other agencies ready to absorb some of the personnel of UNRWA in order to operate?
It is, and we've talked about this, the different structures under which UNRWA and UNICEF operates. And frankly, if the issue is with the people, the Palestinians who work for UNRWA, weren't those same issues applied if you stuck a different logo on them? Thank you. No, I'm done. Thank you.
The 9,832nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Egypt, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Kuwait, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Turkey to participate to this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting. Mr. Gay Pedersen, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, and Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Pedersen. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, Syria seeks to chart a new course following the fall
of the former regime just 1 month ago. Decisions taken now will determine the future for a long time to come. There are great opportunities and real dangers. Syrians and the international community need to get the next phase right, and the UN stands ready to do everything we can to facilitate, to help, and to support. Mr. President, today I have 6 points. First, the caretaker authorities continue to work to structure and consolidate their authority. The caretaker authorities are formed largely of individuals from the former Idlib government. Several governors have also been appointed, not all officially announced, who appear to be their affiliates or armed groups members. There are reports of an in-principle agreement to merge factions under a single Ministry of Defense, though implementation status remains unclear, with some factions reportedly not yet party to this agreement. We have also seen some incidents of local forces restricting access of forces affiliated to the caretaker authorities from entering areas that these local forces control, especially in the south. Meanwhile, a process has also been initiated to settle the status of former army officials through reconciliation centers. The caretaker authorities have issued the first list of the military appointments in the new Ministry of Defense. These appear to be drawn from a range of factions, including Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and also include fighters from foreign countries. The caretaker authorities have held meetings with a very broad range of representatives and individuals of different Syrian groups and components. They also met with visiting foreign ministers and senior officials, and the caretaker foreign minister, al-Shabani, has just returned from a regional visit. Mr. President, my second point. There are signs of instability within areas under the control of the caretaker authorities. While there are many areas where law and order appears to be good, we have seen multiple reports of incidents of violence in the coastal region and Homs and Hama in particular, including accounts of degrading and humiliating treatment. Caretaker authorities have also carried out patrols and what they term combing operations, arresting former officials or elements that they accuse of war crimes or of refusing to hand in weapons and settle. There have been some reports of clashes with what are described as former regime elements, resulting in casualties, including from within the caretaker authorities. There have been videos circulating of what appear to be abuses or extrajudicial killings of officials from the former regime, though we note reports of the caretaker authorities arresting some perpetrators. There are also reports that plans for public sector restructuring may leave many without livelihoods, which may push them into need and further jeopardize stability. On this and on all issues, we urge the caretaker authorities to extend the hand of reassurances and trust to all communities in Syria, fostering the active engagement of all in building the new Syria. Mr. President, third point, there are significant areas outside the control of the caretaker authorities. The conflict continues, and there are also very real threats to Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. The northeast, as well as part of Aleppo city, remain under the control of SDF and YPG. Despite a US-brokered ceasefire near Manbij in December, there have been reports of clashes and exchanges of artillery fire between the SDF and the Syrian National Army forces in particular. Turkey has made statements indicating a clear possibility that Turkish military operations could intensify in the northeast. At the same time, channels of dialogue have been established between the caretaker authorities and the SDF, who met last week in Damascus. Public statements suggest the charting out of positions, but not yet the prospect of imminent agreement. Mr. President, I continue to call for and support the further development of all channels of dialogue and to urge all parties to find a way forward without military confrontation. We are deeply concerned by continued Israeli military presence and activity, including beyond the area of separation in violation of the 1974 disengagement agreement. Furthermore, restrictions on UNDOF's freedom of movement imposed by IDF should be lifted without delay. Attacks on Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity must stop. Reports of the IDF using live ammunition against civilians, displacement and destruction of civilian infrastructure are also very worrying. Such violations, along with Israeli airstrikes in other parts of Syria, reported even last week in Aleppo, could further jeopardize the prospects for an orderly political transition. ISIL remains a significant concern, with ongoing ISIL activities and worries that they may seek to take advantage of security flux in some areas. US-led coalition operations against ISIL continued, including US and French targeted airstrikes. Mr. President, my fourth point, the needs of the Syrian people remain acute. Tom will obviously say more on this, but access to basic and essential services, including healthcare, water, and electricity and housing, remain enormous challenges. The obstacles to the return of IDPs and refugees remain considerable, particularly lack of livelihoods, damaged and destroyed infrastructure, and also widespread landmines, resulting in mounting casualties. I welcome the recent issuance of a new temporary general license by the United States government, but much more significant work in fully addressing sanctions and designations will inevitably be necessary. Mr. President, my fifth point. The way forward on political transition is unclear. There are positive developments to build on, but also points of concern that Syrians are expressing. The leadership initially projected that the current caretaker authorities would operate for up to 3 months in order to ensure no state collapse, followed by broader transitional arrangements. However, there are significant decisions or positions being taken that many Syrians feel should be left to a more inclusive transitional phase, such as articulating positions on the character of the state before a constitutional phase, such as issuing long-term policy decisions with regards to the security sector, or in fields such as education. In the wide-ranging interview, Mr. Ahmed al-Shara stated that there would be a national dialogue process which would be inclusive and comprehensive of many of the Syrian sects, with voting on important and critical issues that should be the foundation of the transitional period. He spoke of a constitution drafting process carried out by experts that could take 2 to 3 years. He spoke of elections that could take up to 4 years, given what he says are necessary preparations, including civil documentation and population data. Some Syrians have received signals from the caretaker authorities positively, especially in terms of stressing inclusiveness and the need to engage a broad spectrum of Syrians in shaping the transitional phase and to draw on expertise of Syrians of all kinds. But at the same time, Mr. President, we have heard concerns at the lack of transparency on the timing, framework, goals, procedures in any national dialogue conference, as well as participation in terms of criteria for attendance and balance of representation. It is crucially important, Mr. President, that the process is not rushed and that it is well prepared and thought through. In this regard, I welcome the fact that the caretaker authorities have now clarified publicly that the conference has been delayed until an expanded preparatory committee can be formed that includes what was called comprehensive representation of Syria from all segments and governors. Mr. President, this leads to my sixth point. We are ready to work with the caretaker authorities on how the nascent and important ideas and steps so far articulated and initiated could be developed towards a credible and inclusive political transition. Further to this Council's important press statement of 17 December, I believe it is well understood that Resolution 2254 cannot be applied in a literal manner. For instance, the former regime will not be a party to any future process, and there are, of course, other examples too. Clearly, there is a need for a new approach and modes of thinking on many fronts. But that being said, there is a wide consensus that the transition does still need to achieve the main things that Resolution 2254 laid out. First, a credible, inclusive and transparent Syrian-led and owned transition. And on this, let me be clear, Mr. President. I do not believe any Syrian is asking for quotas based on sect or ethnicity or importing models from other countries, but rather including the broadest spectrum of Syrian society and Syrian parties so as to inspire public confidence in the transition. Second, ensuring a credible, inclusive and non-sectarian transitional government. Third, a new constitution prepared through a credible and inclusive process. Fourth, free and fair elections, inclusive of all Syrians, in accordance with international standards. Mr. President, Syrian women these past weeks have reinforced their expectations and intent to participate in decision-making throughout the transition process and beyond, at national and local levels. They stress their expectation that any constitutional revision safeguards women's rights and evolved roles and status. Syrian women have much to contribute, and the country should grasp this collective capacity fully. Mr. President, let me also stress that the call for justice, accountability, and reparation is being strongly echoed across different spectrums of society and is a necessary and fundamental safeguard to sustainable peace and social cohesion. This is a long process, obviously, but immediate practical steps are necessary, such as access and authorization for specialized organizations, both local and international, to undertake their work on preservation and documentation. Syrians have accumulated years of work on these issues that must be built on and optimized. So too has the United Nations, including the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the Commission of Inquiry, and the newly established independent institutions on missing persons, all of which have a fundamental role to play today. Mr. President, the points I have described are widely shared among a broad spectrum of Syrians, civil society activists, women, and political forces. I take good note of the fact that the caretaker authorities' leadership have spoken of the need for inclusiveness, including participation from different components, as well as the need for a new constitution and elections. There are therefore tremendous opportunities for building a foundation for lasting peace and stability in Syria. But, Mr. President, missteps and missed opportunities could pose risks to Syria's future and plant seeds of instability. But I do believe that common ground on these issues could readily be developed in a dialogue with the caretaker authorities. And there is genuine expertise and support that can be made available to support a Syrian-led process. Mr. President, I also firmly believe that working on an inclusive political transition is the most effective means to inspire confidence and ensure that Syria quickly receives the economic support that it desperately needs, which requires in turn a smooth end to sanctions, appropriate action on destinations too, and major funding, including for reconstruction. I have informally and formally sought to follow up with the caretaker authorities on the transition and all related issues in an open manner and in partnership, and I believe it is vital that this take place. In order to provide all necessary engagement and support, we are already moving to strengthen the presence and expertise of our political mission in Damascus, and there is active UN planning to ensure delivery as one across all themes of potential support to a credible and inclusive transition. My Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi and many members of my team are in Syria to follow up and to conduct further outreach with a wide range of Syrians. And, Mr. President, I would hope to return to Damascus at the earliest possible time. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Pedersen for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Tom Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Special Envoy Pedersen. Mr. President, recent weeks have been less turbulent than those that preceded our last discussion, but the scale of the humanitarian crisis remains as significant. Following my briefing to you from Damascus, I traveled to Homs, Aleppo, and Idlib to meet Syrian civilians and humanitarians. As Special Envoy Pedersen underlined, we must seize the opportunity of this moment. These visits underscored three critical humanitarian challenges that we and the people of Syria face. First, the need to preserve and rebuild essential services. Health services, already weakened by years of conflict, have been further closed or scaled back at a time when nearly 15 million people require humanitarian health support. Access to water has been restricted, including by fighting at the Tishreen Dam in eastern Aleppo, affecting water and electricity for more than 400,000 people. And close to 13 million people are still facing acute food insecurity, at a time when WFP has been forced to reduce food assistance by 80% in the past 2 years due to funding shortfalls. Lack of food, water, and power is exacerbated by lack of fuel and liquidity. A second priority, protection of civilians. While many of those uprooted in November and December have returned to their homes, more than 620,000 people remain displaced, as harsh winter conditions arrive in many parts of the country. This comes on top of the more than 7 million who were already displaced. In the northwest alone, 2 million people remain in camps and informal sites. In Idlib, I met some of those civilians at Tajma Alij camp. Most want to return home, but cite a lack of adequate services and infrastructure damage, as well as unexploded munitions. And in Aleppo, I met children injured by the deadly legacy of conflict. partners have identified more than 100 contaminated locations since late November across Aleppo, Idlib, Hama, and Latakia. Meanwhile, airstrikes have killed civilians and damaged civilian infrastructure. And in the south, Israeli incursions have forced civilians, including children, injured, and residents, to evacuate parts of Quneitra Governorate. A third priority, a third risk, the threat that women and girls will be marginalized. Throughout my visit, I was struck by their determination to contribute to Syria's future. Rayan, a 12-year-old girl in Aleppo who lost her leg to unexploded ordnance, hopes to be a doctor. Zainab, whose husband was held at Sednaya prison for years and who received his death certificate the morning that we met, wants to see her children complete their education. Jamila, raising 4 children alone, wants to pursue a university degree. Syria's future depends on women like Rayan, Zainab, Jamila. Their voices must be heard in this critical period. Mr. President, as the security situation has stabilized, we've been able to resume our humanitarian operations at much greater scale. In December, we sent 298 trucks of aid through border crossings with Turkey, as many as crossed during the previous 6 months. WHO has supported an EU humanitarian air bridge, providing 50 tons of supplies to northern Syria. In the northeast, a cholera vaccination campaign is underway in Hol camp. UNICEF and partners have led work to restore the functioning of the Tishreen Dam and to rehabilitate other water supplies, including the Ain al-Baida station. WFP and partners have provided bread for more than 2.5 million people. Children and mothers are receiving treatment for malnutrition, but we must do more. We will this month roll out a countrywide rapid needs assessment. We are also adjusting our coordination structures to meet the new operational context. Mr. President, as ever, I have 3 asks of the Security Council. Firstly, your support for the clear assurances that I received from the caretaker authorities that international humanitarian law will be respected, civilians protected, and humanitarian organizations allowed to operate freely. We are continuing our engagement with the caretaker authorities on putting in place new ways of working, including new procedures for registering NGOs. We remain in daily contact on practicalities, and I assess that partnership to be serious and genuine. But security, particularly in Aleppo, Deir ez-Zor, Latakia, and Tartus, remains a challenge. Occasional theft and looting have impeded vaccination support in Homs and insulin supply in Hama. And capacity gaps clearly remain. My second ask, as ever, money, including for the longer-term support that Syria needs. Our humanitarian response is only a third funded. Today, I've allocated from the UN's Central Emergency Response Fund an additional $8 million, for a total of $20 million to support the rapid scaling up of humanitarian operations in Syria. And we welcome recent aid announcements for Syria, including, importantly, from the region. The UN and partners encourage donors to coordinate even more closely to ensure that this support has the greatest benefit, collectively, for people across the country. My third ask, we need to ensure efficient flow of support into and through Syria. This means that sanctions should not impede humanitarian support. The United States announcement of a new general license covering transactions with Syrian governing institutions provides a welcome signal. This also means support for and from Syria's neighbors. Following my visit to Syria, I held practical discussions with authorities in Turkey, in Lebanon, and in Jordan. Operations are continuing at scale through border crossings with Turkey, but cross-line movement remains a challenge in the northeast of Syria. Existing procedures, including for movement of aid workers, have been reinstated at the Lebanese border crossing. The Jabal Nasib crossing with Jordan is also operational, though procedures for humanitarian movements are still being clarified. We are working with the caretaker authorities in Damascus to swiftly establish clear procedures at this crossing and at the seaports. We are also testing deliveries through Iraq to complement existing movements by NGO partners. Mr. President, the active engagement of this Council and the international community remains vital in this period of uneasy transition. We need to act with great urgency and vigor. Above all, and all power to Special Envoy Pedersen's elbow, we need the peaceful political transition that will help us to reduce humanitarian needs. We must stand with the people of Syria at this time. The humanitarian operation can make great impact if we are serious, bold, and committed in their support. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Special Envoy Pedersen and Undersecretary General Fletcher, for your briefings. As we have made clear, the United States supports a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process in the spirit of UN Security Council Resolution 2254. This process should result in an inclusive and representative government that fully respects the human rights and fundamental freedoms of all Syrians, including women and Syria's diverse communities. The transition process and resulting Syrian government must also ensure that any elements of a remaining chemical weapons program are identified, secured, and safely destroyed under international verification. We are encouraged by the cooperation to date and call for the continued commitment of relevant actors in Syria to work with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, the United Nations, and other state and non-state partners to chart a course for the complete and verifiable elimination of any remaining elements of a chemical weapons program. We emphasize the importance of identifying Syrian points of contact to work with the OPCW to set this plan in motion and to provide the security and safety guarantees for OPCW personnel to conduct their verification work. It is also vital for actors in Syria to allow access for UN entities, other international organizations, and civil society to secure documentation, safeguard mass graves and prisons, and assist released detainees and the family of those whose whereabouts remain unknown. As we have noted previously, we were encouraged to hear about the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the IIIM, visit to Syria, and the announcement of a new head of the Independent Institution on Missing Persons, IIMP. We urge interim entities to work closely with these institutions and civil society partners. We further urge Syria's interim entities to deter individual acts of vengeance and to partner with the IIIM to identify paths to ensure accountability. Colleagues, the United States welcomes positive messages from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but will ultimately look for progress in actions, not words. We will explore policies and priorities, or we're looking for actions and words that will explore policies and priorities and prioritize the well-being of the Syrian people. Earlier this week, the United States issued General License Number 24 to expand authorizations for activities and transactions in Syria following December 8th, 2024. The General License underscores our commitment to ensuring that U.S. sanctions do not impede activities to meet basic human needs, including the provision of public services or humanitarian assistance. This authorization is for 6 months as the United States continues to monitor the evolving situation on the ground. The United States is committed to assisting Syrians in this extraordinary moment to forge a new future for and by its people. It is critical all external actors be mindful of the need to maintain stability in Syria. Syria should not be used as a platform to extend other countries' interests at the expense of the Syrian people. Syria's interim entities must ensure the country does not pose a threat to its neighbors, serve as a base for terrorism, or give refuge to groups like the Islamic State or Daesh. In northeast Syria, maintaining the security of detention facilities and displaced persons camps and repatriating foreign nationals remain integral to prevent ISIS's resurgence and promote stability in the region. We look forward to helping secure a brighter future for the Syrian people who desperately need our support and help Syria reclaim its rightful place regionally and on the world stage. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин
Mr. President, we thank Special Envoy Pedersen and the head of OCHA, Tom Fletcher, for their briefings on the situation in the Syrian Arab Republic, the developments in which are being closely followed by the entire international community. Our friends, the brotherly Syrian people that we have always and will continue to provide support, are going through a new stage in their history. For the time being, it's hard to clearly assess the processes taking place on the territory of Syria. Often they are extremely contradictory in nature. We have not yet seen the resumption of the work of key state institutions and vitally important companies. It is not clear how the inclusive nature of the authorities of the future Syria will be ensured, the need for which we are all declaring. There is a fairly high risk of the intensification of hostilities that have encompassed many regions of the country, in particular Aleppo, Deir ez-Zor, Homs, and Quneitra. There are also in the north and the area beyond the Euphrates. In other words, Syria has more than enough problems, and their severity should in no case be underestimated. We would in particular like to point to the direct threat to the territorial integrity of Syria borne by the unlawful actions of Israel, which is carrying out a policy of fait accompli on the occupied Golan Heights, and 500 square kilometers of Syrian land have already been seized. The actions of Israel are a gross violation of international legal decisions, including the many decisions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. We call upon colleagues on the Security Council and also the representatives of the Secretariat of the World Organization to give an honest assessment of events. Mr. President, in these circumstances, Syria continues to face a dire humanitarian crisis that we have heard about today from the head of OCHA. Millions of citizens of this long-suffering country continue to experience serious food shortages and a lack of necessary medical care. That situation has been consistently made worse by Washington, which for several years essentially has occupied the most resource-rich northeastern region of Syria and is also exerting heavy sanctions pressure on Damascus and encouraging its satellites to do the same. As a result, the Syrian economy is under extreme pressure and is not able to cope with the challenges facing the country. Against this extremely worrying backdrop, international humanitarian agencies that have been deprived of their main partners from the Syrian Red Crescent have been forced to start the provision of assistance literally from scratch. Israeli airstrikes and shelling, as well as the rampant violence seen in many regions, is causing suffering, losses among the civilian population, and interrupting the work of civilian infrastructure objects. Regular reports of the disabling of vitally important infrastructure are, of course, of concern. More than 400,000 people in the suburbs of Manbij and Kobani have been left without water and electricity after the hydroelectric power plant at Tishreen stopped working. In the southern part of Idlib and the north of Hama, power grids and roads have been destroyed. Hospitals and primary medical care centers in general across the country are extremely overburdened. In this connection, the primary aim of the new Syrian authorities is what we see as being stopping the bloodshed that is lashing the country. The events are not adding to stability, and the past month has forced hundreds of thousands of ordinary Syrians to leave their homes. The conditions that those people are in remain extremely serious. Many of them have been deprived of access to clean water, sanitary conditions, and basic hygiene products. That situation must fundamentally change for the better as soon as possible, and that is something that the overwhelming majority of residents of Syria are in favor of. Mr. President, we all understand that the new authorities need to go a long way in order to rectify the dire socioeconomic situation and establish an effectively functioning state organs. And of course, in order to do that, they need the support of the international community. That, in our view, should be the focus of the efforts of the UN Security Council. Without outside support based on the principles of humanity and impartiality, Syrians simply will not be able to withstand the tests that they have faced. It's extremely important that assistance is provided to all Syrians in all parts of the country without politicization, discrimination, or preconditions. We regret that donors are not keeping their pledges, and the humanitarian plan for 2024 is financed only at a third. And this is despite the significant increase in the already vast needs. They're also not easing illegal unilateral sanctions that are worsening the suffering of the civilian population. It's also important to understand that the Syrian events did not take place in a vacuum. They took place against the backdrop of the ongoing unprecedented escalation of violence in the region that began from Gaza and extended to the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. The extremely dangerous, provocative rhetoric against Tehran is also not abating. In our view, particular responsibility is borne here by the USA, which has blocked all decisions for a ceasefire in Gaza so as not to prevent West Jerusalem from continuing its military operation there. We regret that, because of Washington, the Council has still not been able to fulfill its direct mandate for the maintenance of peace and security. Mr. President, we all also understand very well that Syria will not have a worthy future unless there is a resilient political process. In these circumstances, the key provisions of the Fundamental Security Council Resolution 2254 on the political transition remain fully relevant, as well as the inclusive nature of the political process. Of continued relevance are the demands in the resolution to respect the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria. Impinging upon those foundations or attempts to replace them are unacceptable and could have irreversible consequences for the future of this country. We are convinced that Syrians and Syrians alone, through an inclusive national dialogue, must determine the future of their country, and we call upon all responsible members of the international community to strictly adhere to this approach and to provide the people of Syria all the assistance they need. At the same time, it is unacceptable for there to be any competition among the key external players and neighbors of Syria, the advancing of self-serving agendas or geopolitical interests in the Syrian arena. In this context, we support the efforts of Special Envoy Pedersen for nationwide de-escalation, the resumption of the political process with UN mediation, and the convening of an international conference on Syria with a broad range of participants. Unless all of these approaches are consolidated, the building of a new Syria will be doomed to fail. We very much hope that the special envoy will be able to ensure a worthy role in the Syrian settlement for the UN. That would be in line with the long-term interests of this country, the Middle East, and the entire international community. Russia stands ready to participate in those efforts for the sake of the Syrian people and its neighbors. We intend in particular to continue to provide the Syrian people with all sorts of assistance, including through specialized international agencies, through the supply of humanitarian assistance, the reconstruction of social infrastructure objects destroyed during the conflict, and the creation of a material basis for the return of Syrian refugees and internally displaced persons. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Special Envoy Peterson and Undersecretary General Fletcher for their briefings and also for their strong engagement on this file in the past intense weeks. Exactly 1 month ago, a new day dawned in Syria. The world watched in astonishment as the fall of the Assad regime inspired hope in millions of Syrians. The hope of a bright and just future for all Syrians to live in freedom and dignity, and future in which the stability, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Syria is upheld. Denmark shares that same hope and stands firmly in solidarity with the Syrian people, who for more than half a century suffered under a brutal dictatorship. Mr. President, there are many facets of this new developing situation, but let me focus on 4. First, the humanitarian crisis in Syria remains extremely dire. As we heard from the USG this morning, even reports of more aid coming in, the combination of winter weather and severe underfunding of the humanitarian response plan, leaves millions of Syrians lacking basic means to survive. Denmark has scaled up our funding for Syria, and we urge all donors to do the same. Aid deliveries, through all possible means, must continue and increase. Humanitarian access to and through areas affected by the conflict must also be ensured. We thank Switzerland for their tireless efforts as the humanitarian penholder on this file and assure the Council of Denmark's steadfast commitment to improving the humanitarian situation across Syria as we take over this role. Second, Mr. President, only with justice can the deep scars of more than a decade of violence begin to heal. Images of torture prisons and mass graves highlight the need for accountability for the crimes of the Assad regime. For far too long, families of missing persons have agonized, the whereabouts of their loved ones unknown. Certainty about the thousands of disappeared Syrians must be established. Denmark fully supports the Commission of Inquiry, the Independent Institution on Missing Persons, and the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, or IIIM. We welcome the interim authorities' call to provide justice for the thousands of torture victims of the Assad regime and encourage them to launch a broad and inclusive transitional justice process. As an immediate measure, we urge the interim authorities to promptly secure all evidence of crime found in prisons, government offices, and archives, and ensure that they can be preserved for future proceedings. We welcome the UN Commission of Inquiry's first visit to Syria and call for the interim authorities to cooperate with the Commission. Mr. President, my third point relates to the security situation. Denmark commends the efforts undertaken to de-escalate the violence inside Syria, including between SNA and the SDF. De-escalation is the first step on the path to political dialogue. Denmark also underscores the importance of the continued fight against terrorism. Terrorist groups such as ISIL or Daesh, Al-Qaeda and their affiliates should not be allowed to take advantage of the situation and regain momentum. Denmark has been committed to combating ISIL since the group's emergence. We remain vigilant in hindering a resurgence in ISIL attacks in the region and globally. Denmark reiterates its full support of UNDOF and underlines that Israel must withdraw from the area of separation. While we recognize legitimate Israeli security concerns, UNDOF must be allowed to move freely and implement its mandate unhindered. We urge all parties to comply with their obligations in that regard. Our overarching goal must be a safe and secure Syria. To achieve that, we need to scale up long-term and sustainable support for early recovery. This can help consolidate and expand the security gains made and mark the beginning of a new era with a safe Syria, where those who could choose to return home receive the support they need. Finally, Mr. President, at this critical time in Syria, an inclusive political process must be front of mind for all of us. Denmark fully supports a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process in the spirit of Security Council Resolution 2254. It is paramount that the Council remains united in this regard. And let me be clear, inclusive peace leads to durable peace. The political process must incorporate all parts of Syrian society. In particular, Syrian women must be in the room and at the table when the future of their country is shaped. This is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Because as the Special Envoy said this morning, Syrian women have much to contribute with. Likewise, we called for the representation of youth and for minorities. Denmark fully supports the work of Special Envoy Peterson and his call for an inclusive political dialogue. We encourage the interim authorities to heed this call and urge them to share a clear roadmap for a credible and inclusive transition. That includes the build-up of institutions and drafting of a new constitution on the basis of a broad national dialogue. Mr. President, in closing, the challenges facing Syria are great. They're interconnected, but they're not insurmountable. Recent developments offer a rare opportunity for peace. Peace for a country which has endured far too much violence over far too long. The past 13 years have been heartbreaking, but now there's a chance for a new beginning. It is incumbent upon all actors, including this Council, to seize this opportunity. Colleagues, this is a chance that simply cannot be missed. Denmark is fully committed to working to this end, to support a Syrian-led political process that includes all parts of Syria's society, that paves the way to a peaceful and stable future for all Syrians. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd also like to thank Special Envoy Pedersen and OCHA USG Tom Fletcher for their timely briefings and their tireless and dedicated efforts. The choices we make today, big or small, will shape Syria's trajectory for decades to come. Thus, it is essential to think beyond the present crisis and make decisions that will stand the test of time. I would like to make the following points in this regard. First, all hostilities across the country must cease. As Syria emerges from 14 years of brutal conflict, it is crucial that no party reignites hostility or deepens tensions for their parochial or short-sighted interests. On that note, the IDF's expansion beyond the demilitarized buffer zone and the Israel Prime Minister's directive for the IDF to remain in Mount Hermon until at least the end of 2025 is concerning. These actions mark the first occupation of new Syrian territory since the 1970s, an explicit violation of the 1974 agreement and the blatant obstruction of the mandate of UNDOF. And this places the Syrian caretaker government in a difficult position as it strives to establish legitimacy at this critical juncture. Such Israeli actions against Syria's territorial integrity must cease as soon as possible. Also worrisome is the continued fighting in northern Syria between the SDF and SNA, which undermines prospects for a peaceful and inclusive transition while offering Daesh maneuvering space to rebuild and recruit. We urge international actors to exercise influence over the parties to immediately halt the violence and seek a constructive and mutually acceptable solution. Second, all relevant actors on the ground must prioritize actions to counter Daesh's resurgence. Experts, including the monitoring team of the 1267 Committee, repeatedly warned of this threat last year, yet such warnings seem unheeded. SDF and the Syrian military facilities have been consistently attacked over the last month, weakening their ability to contain Daesh. Meanwhile, reports indicate that Daesh's resurgence in Syria has resulted in closer coordination with its international operatives beyond its border. Halting this cross-border threat must become an immediate priority for all concerned parties. Third, we urge the caretaker government to align its ongoing transitional efforts with Resolution 2254, which remains a cornerstone of the peaceful and inclusive transition of Syria. The Assad regime's collapse itself does not constitute the implementation of the resolution. Rather, it is merely a starting point. Resolution 2254's main objectives, an inclusive transitional government, a new constitution, and the free and fair elections for all Syrians, have yet to be fulfilled. We trust that these agreed-upon objectives will guide the actions of Syrians and others moving forward. Fourth, the international community must double down on alleviating Syria's humanitarian and economic challenges in an urgent manner and from a long-term perspective. In this regard, we reiterate our support for the early recovery strategy announced by OCHA last year. We also welcome the recent U.S. general license for Syria, which will help ease the country's economic hardships. At the same time, despite the recent scaled-up aid and unimpeded cross-border operations, Syria's crippled economy and devastated infrastructure is compounded by new IDPs and refugee returns. Recognizing UNHCR's call on all states to respect the principle of non-refoulement at all times, we hope that the international community's enhanced engagement on early recovery implementation will lay the favorable foundation for the safe, voluntary return of Syrian refugees. Mr. President, in closing, the Republic of Korea reaffirms the importance of the UN in facilitating an inclusive, Syrian-led political process, and we look forward to a successful national dialogue organized by the caretaker government in due course. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. First of all, I wish to thank Special Envoy Patterson and USG Fletcher for their briefings. At present, the situation in Syria is at a critical stage with daunting challenges. The international community should strengthen its solidarity and coordinate its actions to support and help Syria achieve stability and development. I wish to make 4 points. First, China supports a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process in accordance with the spirit and principles of Council Resolution 2254. The international community must effectively respect Syria's right to pursue a path of development in line with its national conditions and allow the Syrian people to decide on their country's future based on their will. China notes that the National Dialogue Conference scheduled for January the 5th has been postponed. We expect the Syrian parties to start an open and inclusive political settlement process in the long-term interests of the country and its people. China supports a greater role for the UN and Special Envoy Patterson in that process. Second, no matter how the domestic situation in Syria develops, the bottom line of zero tolerance for terrorism cannot be changed. The Council recently issued a press statement on Syria, defining that states should combat all terrorist organizations listed by the Council and deny safe haven for terrorists. It is reported that the Syrian army has recently granted senior military ranks to a number of foreign terrorist fighters, including the head of Council-listed terrorist organization, the Turkestan Islamic Party, also known as the East Turkestan Islamic Movement. China is gravely concerned about this. We call on Syria to fulfill its counterterrorism obligations and to prevent any terrorist forces from using the Syrian territory to threaten the security of other countries. Third, Syria has one of the worst humanitarian situations, with more than 16 million people in dire humanitarian straits and a prolonged illegal unilateral sanctions have further aggravated the suffering of the Syrian people, the international community should increase its assistance to Syria. The UN should play a coordinating role, speeding up the implementation of humanitarian projects and prioritizing the needs of the population to survive the winter. The Syrian parties should abide by the international humanitarian law, cooperate actively with humanitarian operations, and ensure humanitarian access and the safety of humanitarian personnel. Fourth, the Golan is internationally recognized as occupied Syrian territory. Resolution 497, adopted by the Council, determines the legal status of the Golan and makes it clear that the Israeli occupation of the Syrian Golan is null and void. China reiterates that the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria should be respected, that the Council's resolution on the Golan must be implemented, and that the 1974 agreement on disengagement of forces should be complied with. In closing, I would like to reiterate that China has long pursued a policy of friendship and cooperation with Syria and has never interfered in its internal affairs. We stand ready to continue working with the international community for Syria to have a smooth transition and gradually embark on a path of peaceful development. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also want to thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Undersecretary General Fletcher for their briefings today. Images of Syrians celebrating the start of a new chapter of their country fill us with hope. However, let us be clear, the wounds run deep and the stakes remain incredibly high, as we heard from Special Envoy today as well. There is much work to be done, and every step forward is critical. Peace is never easy. It must be carefully built. So, Mr. President, allow me to share some of our thoughts on the future of Syria. First, the future of Syria should be inclusive. This must be based on an all-inclusive, Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process, in line with the key principles of the Resolution 2254. All Syrian people must have an opportunity for their voice to be heard and considered. This new Syria must be for all Syrians. We therefore urge a UN-facilitated political process leading to a credible, inclusive, and non-sectorial governance. We continue calling for full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women and minority groups in peace and security processes and decision-making at all levels. Second, the future of Syria must be safe and secure. As pockets of violence and conflict still persist, we call for full respect of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. This includes any law enforcement operations. The fighting still witnessed in northern Syria must cease. We need a solution that protects everyone's security interests, including our collective security interest in fighting Daesh. Syria cannot be used as a base for terrorism. Any remaining stockpiles of chemical weapons in Syria must be secured and safely destroyed. The same goes for explosive remnants of war, which continue to pose high risk to human lives and livelihoods, including food security. Sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity and unity of Syria must be respected. We remain deeply concerned about the situation in the area of separation. 1974 disengagement agreement must be implemented in its entirety. Finally, the future of Syria must be based on protection. Civilians' critical infrastructure and humanitarian facilities must be safeguarded and unimpeded access to humanitarian aid granted. Providing conditions for safe and dignified life for all is of crucial importance. We welcome the scaling up of assistance in areas where conditions allow. We join the calls for additional international support for the efforts of the UN and humanitarian organizations. We also call for respect and protection of human rights. in particular for the rights of women and girls and of minorities. With a high number of detained, abducted, and missing persons, it is crucial that all Syrians know the fate of their loved ones. Answers for families of the missing will open path to closures at individual level.